Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. The Israeli war is still in the news, very much so, as is the idea of social justice or woke. And plus, we have these protests occurring on college campuses. So, I read a very interesting article recently by today's guest on how the war in Israel has exposed the hypocrisy of woke. So I decided to give him an email and have him on. Robert Tracinski, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on again.
I should say that Rob he studied philosophy at the University of Chicago, and he's been a writer, lecturer, and commentator for more than 25 years. He's the editor at Symposium, and he is also a senior fellow at the Atlas Society. Did I get all that correct, Robert?
Yeah, you should probably also add that my main sort of home base is the Tracinski letter, tracinskiletter.com. And that's sort of my main newsletter, and everything else sort of branches off from there. Many different things I'm doing.
Okay, so cards on the table. First of all, what are your thoughts on the war in Israel? I mean,
well,
was Hamas justified? Is the response justified? Is the response, too much?
Yeah.
What do you think about the basics?
All right, so well, that's a lot to go over. But first of all, I want to say I don't want to call it the war in Israel or the Israel war or something like that. This is the Hamas war. This is the Gaza war, because this was absolutely. I mean, if you saw what Hamas did on October 7th, they break down the walls, they go into Israel, and they just simply engage in the mass indiscriminate, killing, torture, rape, abduction of civilians. So this, what I think I showed to this is that one of the things that this demonstrated was that the program of Hamas, the goal of Hamas, is not their own state. It's not the prosperity of their people. It is genocide. It is basically the mass indiscriminate killing of Jews. So that indicates what Hamas's goal is. And so I think the absolute correct response is Israel, no state could tolerate this. And by the way, you can put this in perspective. There's like 1,200 people or so who were killed and a couple hundred more taken hostage. I mean, you have to multiply those numbers by like 20 or 30 to get something, maybe even more, but about 30 or so, to get to the equivalent of what that would be in the United States. So it'd be like somebody, launching an attack in the United States that killed tens of thousands of people here and abducted thousands. The scale of it, just to get the sense, because, I know some Israelis, they were beside themselves because every Israeli I knew somebody who had been killed, whole families who had basically just been wiped out by this. So you have to get the idea of the scale of the trauma to Israel of this attack. And of course, it was exactly the sort of thing they've been guarding against, and then the government failed, very conspicuously failed to guard against it in this case. But they have to do something. They can't. No state can permit this kind of danger to exist. Yeah. So they have to go in and they have to get rid of Hamas. I think they're doing. I mean, I don't think they're going to do. I think they're going to cause more damage in some ways than they need to, and probably less in other ways. I'm concerned that they will sort of like cause a whole bunch of damage and then withdraw under international pressure and not really accomplish what they need to accomplish. I think what they need to do is they need to be able to do some of the stuff we've been seeing. You see these pictures of the guys in their underwear being herded around. These are people who surrendered. Now, they're saying like 10% of them are Hamas. The other 90% they're screening and then they're releasing. They're just civilians. They have them in their underwear because they don't know if they have weapons. They don't know if they have bombs. And those photos have leaked out. But that's essentially what they need to be doing. Is they need to go through Gaza. They need to clear it out piece by piece, sort out the people in there. Who are the civilians? Who are the militants? The militants have to go off and be imprisoned. I think anybody who's connected to October 7th, I'm assuming, those people will get the death penalty of some sort. Because these guys were wearing cameras, documenting what they were doing. They left plenty of evidence of what are essentially war crimes. I mean, by the way, the Geneva Convention does not apply to Hamas. They were non-uniformed, irregular combatants. They were violating the rules of war themselves. So, the usual, they're not just POWs; they're criminals. It's like catching pirates, right? Okay. So the laws that apply to that apply to pirates and to war criminals apply to Hamas. But they're going to have to clear out Gaza. They're going to have to filter the combatants from the non-combatants. I don't like to use the word innocent civilians because there's a lot of civilians in Gaza who supported Hamas, right? Which
Sure.
makes them not exactly innocent, but on the other hand, they are non-combatants. And by the rules of war, you are not supposed to target non-combatants. You can't just indiscriminately kill non-combatants. So you have to basically sort the combatants from the non-combatants. You need to then, what I think Israel has unfortunately been trying to avoid doing for many decades, which is what got them into this, is they're going to have to impose some kind of regime of occupation, of rehabilitation, something to prevent Hamas or a group like Hamas coming and just taking over again and having this whole cycle repeat again in 15 years. And I think that's what they did. The mistake they made is they lifted the occupation of the Palestinian territories, and they said, well, we're just going to let them off on their own. We're going to wall them off. We're going to literally build walls around them, and then they can be on that side of the wall. We're on this side of the wall, and we won't try to exert any kind of control, any kind of occupation, any kind of we're not going to try to impose some kind of civilized order in there. We'll let them fight it out amongst ourselves, the different factions. We'll let them, engage in training a whole generation, indoctrinating them in terrorism, and then we'll sit behind our walls. Well, that didn't work out because first they lobbed rockets over the walls, and then they broke down the walls and came and attacked. So I think they're going to have to go back to what they didn't want to do before, which is some sort of long-term system for imposing a more civilized order on Gaza. And I think that's going to be what they're going to shrink from. Nobody wants to do this, right? Nobody wants to do a proper counterinsurgency. We didn't want to do it when we did it in Iraq, right? We decided eventually we didn't want to do it in Afghanistan. So nobody wants to do this kind of long-term counterinsurgency, but it is the only option Israel has, because I'll finish up here, but the big picture I have on this is that if Israel actually were a colonial occupier, they would have withdrawn and gone home by now, right? If they were the equivalent of, the British Empire. Well, the British Empire eventually got tired of having to police the colonies and put down insurgencies, and they said, we're just going to go home and we're going to leave. The U.S. did that in Afghanistan. We decided we're tired of doing this counterinsurgency. We're going to go home. We're going to leave. If the Israelis are equally tired and have been for a long time, and their sort of policy of disengagement where they just walled off Gaza, that was their attempt to say, we're going to go home, we're going to leave. The problem is they can't do that because they are home, right? They don't have anywhere else to go. Israel is their home. So they're going to have to say, well, they're going to have to realize at some point, you can't just get tired of doing the counterinsurgency and doing the occupation. You have to get better at it. You can't get tired of it. You have to get better at it, and you have to eventually persist at it until it works. And, the fact that Israel has a large Arab population of Israeli Arabs who are Israeli citizens. And I think their level of patriotism, of pro-Israel sentiment among the Arab population of Israel went up after the October 7th attacks. So it's clear that they can live side by side peacefully with Arabs and Muslims. And because not all Arabs, some Arabs are in the area are Christian. These two people can live side by side peacefully. Israel has actually demonstrated that. You just have to figure out how to make it possible to get to that.
The idea that Israel is somehow committing a genocide is so ludicrous. The amount of Arabs in Israel has increased since
I think
Israel's
the number of Arabs in Gaza, the population of Gaza has increased like 70%. I mean, literally the average age, it's been like 20 years since they engaged in genocide against Gaza. And the average age of the population is like 18 years old, which means that the majority of people living there were born under this supposedly oppressive rule. Now, I want to say, the situation of the people in Gaza is not great. They have been sort of walled off. They have been held back economically, all that sort of thing. But that was all necessary because they had a government. They had a leadership. Hamas isn't exactly a government. It doesn't really have that kind of legitimacy. But they had a leadership, a dominant power and control that made it necessary for Israel to wall them off. So I think that the larger. I'm working on a piece right now where I want to talk about how the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause is one of the world's greatest, largest demonstration of how not to pursue the interests of your own people, how not to pursue the interests of your cause. It's like it is one of the losingest causes in the world, and it's because they did it, they pursued it in exactly the wrong way. And I think there's some great lessons for us from this, which is, first of all, it's like they combined all the worst things in our own culture, in American culture, and decided we're going to go all in on those. And the worst things are anti-colonial, sort of revolutionary Marxist militancy, right? That there's a huge element of that in the way the Palestinians have approached it. And then the second thing they did was ethnic, religious, intolerant, fanatical nationalism, right? So Hamas is a radical Islamic fanatical religious group. So they basically said, we're going to take all the worst things to the right and all the worst things to the left. We're going to make that our leadership, and we're going to follow them, and then we're going to see where we get. Well, where you get is exactly what has happened to the Palestinian people. Where you get is poverty and stagnation and mass death, and the leadership that is totally indifferent to the lives of its people. There's some great interviews, really telling interviews that came out with Hamas after October 7th, where they said, the problem is, the Israelis love life, but we love death. We want our people to be martyrs for the cause. So the death of civilians in Gaza is not some accidental consequence. It is the Hamas plan that civilians will be sacrificed to be made into religious martyrs for the cause. So I think this is sort of a giant cautionary tale of here's what happens if you let a combination of radical left revolutionaries and religious fanatics be your leadership.
So the piece that you wrote talked about the hypocrisy of the woke movement. So before we can understand how the war on Gaza, or war in Gaza, the Hamas war, has exposed that hypocrisy, what do you mean by the woke movement, or woke, or social justice movement? They're all sort of synonyms of each other, but what exactly are we talking about?
Right. So wokeness has, there's a famous thing, Bethany Mandel, who's a writer, famously had this, was asked in an interview, how do you define woke? And she basically stammered for 5 minutes and couldn't give an answer. Woke, unfortunately, so by its nature, it started out as a slang term, right? It's a slang term for staying awake. And the question, but it helps to question, what does it mean? What are you being awakened to? Right. So it started as a slang term, and slang terms by their definition, by their very nature, have no formal definitions. It became loosely associated, though, with the idea. I think originally the meaning was what you're supposed to be awakened to was the persistence of racism in society. And this has roots in the 60s and 70s, right at the end of the civil rights movement, when there was a lot of racism. There had very recently been institutionalized, legally enforced racism. So the idea of being awakened to the presence of racism in the society, that was the original idea. But since then, what it became associated with a particular view of what racism is and how racism is institutionalized. And that is the critical theory approach. And this is something that came out of postmodern philosophy and became a fad in academia, especially in the 70s and 80s. And it sort of has filtered down now to the popular level. And the essentials of this critical theory approach is, first of all, that we are all defined by our racial or ethnic identity. Right? So identity is such an important thing for them. And identity doesn't mean your individual identity as a person. It means your identity as a member of a group. So our group identity, what racial or ethnic group we belong to, defines everything about us. And if you're in several different groups, there's intersectionality, the intersection between, I'm a gay, black, left-handed lesbian tugboat worker, whatever, whatever
the victim
it is.
Olympics, right? You get the gold medal.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
and there's this sort of
intersectionality.
There's this sort of competition, implicit competition out there, where if you can intersect as many different victim group identities as possible, then you win the prize as being the most victimized person. And then there you get the most privilege, or the world owes you the most in return because of your victimized status. So it's this idea of viewing yourself purely in terms of your group identity, which group you are a member of. So it's this very collectivist viewpoint that my group membership defines everything about me. And the second thing is that characterizes this critical theory approach, which has been then known popularly as wokeness, is the idea that these patterns of racial and group identity shape absolutely everything. They're at the root of everything. They're behind everything, even things that don't seem to be political at all. So, sex, romance, sports, every issue out there, it's all, hidden behind it is some secret racial history or some secret pattern of racial oppression. And then the last thing I would say is that wokeness is characterized by the idea that this is just the nature of the world and it's going to be like this forever. That there is no, this isn't, the idea of people being in patterns of oppression based on their racial identity is not an unfortunate history that we have to get beyond. It is that this is just the way the universe works, and this is going to, it's this from now into forever. Right. So this is, there is no redemption. There's no, if racism is our original sin, somebody described it as it's like a religion with original sin, but no concept of redemption, no concept of salvation. Right. So you have the original sin is racism, but there's no redemption. We're never going to be cured from it. It's this way going forward. So that's what I would describe as, the thing that people vaguely refer to as wokeness. Now, obviously, in popular parlance, the left has decided, oh, that's a totally made up term. We never used that. They did use it. And the right has decided everybody hates wokeness. So let's take everything we don't like and define it as wokeness. Okay. Right. So the way I put it is if wokeness for you is a perfect circle Venn diagram with everything you don't like, you're doing it wrong. But if wokeness for you is just puppies and sun and rainbows and something nobody could possibly object to, then you're also doing it wrong, right? So you have to. There's a history of this. There are certain ideas out there, and they have a specific identity, and you have to define those, which I hopefully did in a concise enough way just now.
I actually heard Ibram X. Kendi use the term woke in not a pejorative way during a lecture he was given. I was able to listen to it in podcast form or digital, I don't know what it is. But
it's funny. I'm an objectivist, and I have called myself an objectivist for coming up on 40 years now, 35 years maybe. And I've never felt the need to change the term, but there are certain ideologies out there where they come up with a term and that they use for themselves, and then after a while, when people start to dislike it and say, oh, those people are terrible, I don't like those people, then they change what they call themselves because they don't want to be tagged and identified and nailed down that way. Go ahead.
They seem to, well, not seem, they do, this emphasis on race, ethnicity, they would seem to favor people that have been oppressed. That's who they're looking for, right? Now, historically, there's very few ethnicities or religions that have been more oppressed than Jews. So it would seem as if the woke amongst us would want to embrace Jews, right? But that's not what's happened.
Yeah, there's an old running joke that went around the internet, probably predates the internet, about how you could sum up different religions and philosophies in various versions of I'll clean this up for a family audience, of same stuff, different day. Yeah. And I think that's Buddhism, the same stuff, different day. And the version for Judaism was, why does this stuff keep happening to us? That these are people who have basically been kicked around for the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, invaded and deported and spread out throughout the world and persecuted in various ways. So yeah, that's the thing, is that I think that's the big thing that's coming out right now, and it's especially in the last couple of weeks, that in the reaction to October 7th, you saw these people, these woke people, the people who say silence is violence, and that speech can be violence. An act of horrible barbaric violence was committed by Hamas, and some of them were actually actively cheering it on, and many others were essentially indifferent to the fate of the Jews. And so it's like, if you're for marginalized people and victim groups and people who have been victims because of their ethnic and religious identity, why is there a giant asterisk in front of that says, except for the Jews? And I think that sort of gives the lie to everything that we've been told. And I think specifically there's one aspect of this. Now, this came up, I wrote a piece about this a week or two ago, and I think you're probably going to link to that. But the thing that happened right after that is they had a couple of these heads of, the head of Harvard and University of Pennsylvania, and I think one other school, they had them come to Congress to give this testimony. And they're asked, well, would somebody advocating genocide of the Jews, would that be hate speech that's against your university's rules? And they couldn't give a clear, straight answer to it. They couldn't say, yes, this is hate speech, or this is against our code of conduct, and we would punish it. Actually advocating genocide of the Jews wouldn't count to this. Now, the reason that's such a big sort of head exploding moment, right, is because the wokeness and political correctness, as we used to call it, one of its signatures is we're going to police everybody's speech. And even the most seemingly insignificant, seemingly innocuous thing that you say that's considered the wrong kind of speech, we're going to police that. J.K. Rowling is a horrible bigot because she doesn't accept the exact formulas we'd want her to accept. It just repeat the exact formulas we want her to repeat about trans people. Even though if you hear what she says, she has a very reasonable, nuanced, non-hateful approach to it. But again, she's wrong because she won't mouth the words. Or if you use any kind of if you wear the wrong kind of Halloween costume, right, you're a horrible racist and a bigot. And so they've been applying like this microscope to everyone to search for any little clue about any possible implicit thing that you might say that might imply a hateful attitude towards other people. And then you have these pro-Palestinian activists who will go out and say, from the river to the sea. Now, this slogan, from the river to the sea, means from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. It means all of Israel. And the idea is that they're going to take over all of Israel and they're going to push all of the Jews out. At the very least, it's a call for, sort of mass deportation and ethnic cleansing. At the most, it's a call for genocide. This is something, though, that you have to, we don't really know what the person meant by that. And maybe it depends on the context, whether that would be hateful, right? So they've been applying a microscope to everybody else's speech, searching it for the slightest possible hint or implication, even an unknown one to you, of a hateful meaning to it. But then, on the other side, when it comes to the Jews, when it comes to Israel, free reign, you can say whatever the things that really do imply ethnic cleansing or genocide. We depends on context. We can't really judge. And that's what sort of gives the lie to the whole thing about wokeness or political correctness, is that they really weren't concerned about victimized people. They weren't concerned about social justice. They weren't concerned about violence towards ethnic and religious minorities. It was really, they were concerned about power for their group, power for their side.
Why do you suppose when it comes to Jews, there's this different take? Is it just because they want power for their own side? Because I mean, anti-Semitism is the easy thing to go to. And I'm not saying there's none of that there, but it just seems to me that there has to be more. And maybe you don't know. I mean,
I've got a couple ideas of this.
I think let's hear it.
Well, this is one of these things where you come up across against something this bad, and there's probably like it's like 3 or 4 different causes all at work at once, because it has to be, things have to sort of pile up. So, for example, one of the things I found in here is that there is this little ugly little side current of this, is there is a history of Black anti-Semitism. Now, obviously, it's not all the history, because one of the things I point out in the article I wrote about this recently is that one of the complaints people had against the 1619 Project is that it implied that, Black people had to fight completely alone for civil rights. Well, they didn't have to fight completely alone. They had many allies. And among the most prominent allies were Jews, American Jews, because American Jews saw and said, look, we're in the same boat. If they could treat you like second-class citizens, they could treat us like second-class citizens. And so American Jews were among early organizers, early funders, early supporters of the civil rights movement all along, right? So, and there's a long history of that, in the NAACP, of cooperation and this sort of being allies and being in the same boat that Jews and Black leaders had. But there's also a strain there that goes back to like Louis Farrakhan and Al Sharpton, who somehow got rehabilitated as a civil rights leader. He started his career by stoking anti-Semitism. It probably has some root in the fact that in some of the inner city Black neighborhoods, the sort of ghetto, quote unquote, ghetto neighborhoods, funny, ghetto is a term, used for Black neighborhoods. It was originally named after the Jewish neighborhood in Italy, where the Jews were allowed, were made to stay separate from everybody else. But the inner city black neighborhoods, the poor inner city black neighborhoods with high crime rates, oftentimes the other regular mainstream shops wouldn't set up because the crime was too high and that sort of thing. And oftentimes it was immigrants who would be willing to take the chance and the extra risk of starting shops there. So a lot of times, especially in New York, there were Jewish shop owners. So they got the resentment of the local population of, oh, you're charging us higher prices, you're taking advantage of us. And maybe that's part of the root of this Jewish anti-Semitism, black anti-Semitism. So that's like in the mix there. I don't think that's a major cause because that's been around for a while. The other part of it is that wokeness implies tribalism. And it implies my group versus your group. I think of myself as a member of this group and other people as a member of a different group. And it preaches that sorting yourself into tribes. And also you're seeing yourself as constantly basically the victim of a conspiracy by everybody else in every other group to take advantage of you and to keep you down. So the sense of there's a future we're working forward where we'll all be brothers and these divisions won't exist anymore. Without that, if all you have is, well, it's my tribe and there's other people's tribes and they're all out to get us and everybody else, you're trying to make me a victim. It gives you a sort of conspiracy theory mentality. This idea that, all of society is a giant conspiracy to keep me and my type down. And when you get that, then it's really easy to divide people up in that tribalistic kind of way, and oftentimes very simplistically, and also to believe in all sorts of conspiracies. So one of the things that's happened is, and people have been pointing us out, that especially in academia, in the universities, where there was taught this very much, there's a white oppressor, everybody's sorted into victim and oppressor, and there's the white oppressors over here and the victims over there. And so a bunch of European Jews, they get lumped into the white oppressor framework. Now, throw into this, I think, the last final thing that I think we need to have as part of it, which is that Israel has been successful. Israel, we could talk about Israel. They've been, they went through the Holocaust. They were victims of horrible injustice and, the 2,000 years of oppression, et cetera. But what I find interesting is that Jews never got hated quite as much as when they stopped being victims. When they set up their own country, they made the desert bloom, as the phrase famously goes. They made it prosperous, they made it powerful, and they have a successful army that won 2 major wars and has, nobody's been able to defeat them in roughly 75 years of Israel's existence. So I think also there's this extent to which they were perceived, because they're powerful, because they're not victims anymore, then they lose that sympathy of being a victim group. And so you go looking for some other victim group that is then going to counterpose against them. And there is, like I mentioned earlier, the Palestinians the old phrase about them is they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. The Palestinians have basically been sabotaging their own cause since 1948.
Abba Ibn. That's who
that?
said that. Abba Ibn.
Yeah, that's I couldn't remember
who
it was. But it's an old saying. I think it was back in the 70s he said that, right?
Maybe even the 60s, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, in 1948, they were offered their own state side by side with the new state of Israel. And it was larger than the territory they control now. And they said, no, we're going to attack you and we're going to drive you into the sea. And ever since then, they have, consistently missed every opportunity they could possibly have had to have peace with Israel, to have their own state, to live in some kind of harmony and prosperity with these neighbors. And so if you're looking for the ultimate victim group, there they are, because they've consistently made all the wrong decisions and caused a lot of destruction to themselves. Unfortunately for their people. I mean, the suffering is very much continuing to today. I mean, there's going to be a lot of horrible carnage in Gaza because of the Hamas leaders not caring about the backlash, the blowback from it.
So, like you said, the hypocrisy in the social justice movement is being exposed here. Do you think that it's coming to an end? The whole, I mean, I don't think it'll ever completely end, but I mean the preeminence that it sort of had over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years. Do you think that it's dying down now? And what can we do? What can we do to facilitate its demise?
Yeah, that's a $64,000 question. Gosh, that's an old reference. People probably don't even know that. There used to be a game show called the $64,000 question. Anyway, it's not important. So that's the big question. That's the question everybody wants to try to figure out. There has been some speculation in the last few years that, because I remember it was like 2014 that the current woke fad. So, this goes back a long time. When I was in college, we called it political correctness, right? In like the late 80s, early 90s. They called it political correctness. And it was this idea that everything has to be politically correct by this sort of far left Marxist standards, that all your speech had to be policed to make sure you were saying things and doing things, and your sex life had to be policed to make sure that it was, had the right Marxist political content or something like that. And this goes back to, was it the Soviet school of art was socialist realism, where what they had, their approach towards art, all movies had to have the right political message to it, and having the right political message was the only important thing about it. And was it Sergei Eisenberg, a very famous pioneering early filmmaker, was criticized by the Soviet authorities because a movie he made had no socialist content in it. So this is an idea that goes, and it goes back all the way to Marx, who had this idea that, look, every art ideas, everything going on in society, it all just reflects these underlying relationships of oppressor to oppressed. It's all just a legitimating ideology to support the existing system of capitalist exploitation of the workers, and therefore art, sex, ideas, philosophy, all of that has to be subordinated to political control for the sake of class warfare, right? So this is something that goes all the way back to Marx. It is this collectivist, literally collectivist, the idea that the collective, the group, is all that exists, and the individual has to be made to conform to the group. And you had the old Marxist version. It has the new race, class, and gender version. That's sort of a variation on that, but this is a very old thing. It's not going to go away. But the current wave of it sort of started bubbling up and really getting noticed around 2014. I wrote an article back then called "Confessions of a Reluctant Culture Warrior," because I felt like I got dragged kicking and screaming into having to deal with these kind of controversies happening every couple of months. And then it became every week, and then now it's sort of constant. And Andrew Sullivan said, we all live on campus now, right? So the campus free speech wars came for everyone. The point of all that is that this is not going to go away, but it has peaked like from 2014 to roughly 2021, 22. It was on this steep upward trajectory where it was becoming more and more intense. And I think this is an ideology. It's a mindset. I lived, having lived through the previous version of political correctness, which kind of peaked in the 90s and then faded away. There is a natural kind of pathway here that, because this is so hectoring, so puritanical, so intrusive, and because it targets everyone, right? It doesn't just target the people who are on the other side, the enemies, the alt-right and the neo-Nazis. It doesn't just target them. It then goes after sort of ordinary conservatives, and then against classical liberals, and then against regular left-to-center liberals who aren't radical enough. First we'll purge the enemies, then the counter-revolutionaries, then we'll purge the insufficiently enthusiastic. And then it comes for J.K. Rowling, which is, I think that was sort of like the big turning point, because she's, the idea that she's a bigot is ridiculous. So as it came after more and more of those people, it generates its own enemies. It is a philosophy, a mindset, a way of arguing and practicing things that generates its own enemies. I think the right has its own equivalent of that in Trumpism. And the nationalists, but it does generate its own enemies. It generates its own resistance, and it generates them not just among us, reprobates out here, cast out as designated as the enemy because we're pro-capitalists or individualists or whatever. It also goes after the centrists. It goes after the mainstream respectable people, and I think eventually it just generates so much resistance to itself that I think it started to peak a couple of years ago. But it's still at a very high level. It's just, I think it's like not growing anymore. And I think this is going to be, I've seen evidence of a lot of people on the center left sort of waking up and saying, well, and especially people who were allies of this movement, who are Jewish, who are saying, well, wait a minute, I thought we were doing this because we were in favor of protecting marginalized and oppressed peoples. And now you're saying that doesn't include, victims of rape. So part of the scandal on this, which has been a lot of pushback, is it took 2 months after October 7th. It took 2 months for the first international women's rights group to actually file a formal statement about the use of rape by Hamas on October 7th, right? So it's like, we're supposed to believe all women, and we're supposed to be against sexual violence and oppression of women. Again, giant asterisk, except for the Jews.
Yeah.
So that's good. I think that's waking up a lot of people. And was it an article in the New York Times recently about how, well, there's progressives and there's liberals, and those are two different things. And, it seems obvious to me, the difference there. But some people, again, it's something that's happened to a lot of us, I think, on the right over the last 10 years, 7, 8 years, since the rise of Trumpism, is the idea of thinking of, okay, we have our differences, but, these other people are our allies. In my case, I knew conservatives who thought, okay, they're kind of on the same side. We have strong differences, but we can work together on a lot of things. And then sort of slowly coming to the realization that what they want is fundamentally radically different from what I want. And they're willing to basically torpedo this whole alliance, and they're willing, these people would ship me off to the camps if they thought they had the power to do it. So people I used to sort of get along with, okay, well, we can all agree that religious freedom is a good thing. I'm an atheist, you're a Christian. We can all agree that religious freedom is good, though. And now they're saying, no, we want to have the ability to impose our religion on you. So
Yeah.
this is a sense you go through of thinking, okay, these people are my allies. They're on the same side. We have differences, but we can get along. And then realizing, no, actually, these people hate me. And I think people on the left have been going through that process. I think they're beginning that process. I think they have a lot more introspection they need to do about, how is it that liberalism, which is supposed to mean being pro-freedom, is supposed to mean the maximum individual liberty. How is it that liberalism became associated with this, well, it's not even progressive either. I mean, they're not for progress, but with this radical leftist ideology that is against all of that. So I think they're just at the beginning of starting to ask those questions.
All right, Robert, anything that we've left unsaid on this rather important topic, in my view? Anything that I forgot to ask that you'd like to say?
Oh, I think we're coming up on time. I think the answer here, the thing that we need to start. I see all of this as, again, this is a danger. It's a terrible thing that's happening. It's also an opportunity, because when people get shaken by this and they start asking questions like, well, what is the difference between liberals and progressives? It's a time for us to raise our hands and say, I've got some ideas for you as to what that might be. And I think the fundamental thing is that the biggest mistake conservatives ever made, on my view, is accepting the idea that their enemies were liberals, and taking the sort of early 20th century FDR big government types and agreeing to call them liberals. They were never a liberal. They were never liberal in the sense of being pro-freedom. They weren't even, especially the farther you go back to the early 20th century, a lot of these people on the left weren't even pro-free speech. They were very much, I mean, Woodrow Wilson, the great progressive hero Woodrow Wilson, threw people in jail for criticizing his administration and criticizing World War I. So, these people were not for free speech. They weren't for freedom in economics. They really are not a pro-freedom movement. And I think that's the thing that the left has to grapple with, is that you have this whole sort of Marxist collectivist variations on it, quote unquote progressive, that is deeply collectivist. And that collectivism is by its nature an illiberal doctrine. The idea that you, the individual, have to be sacrificed to, that you have to be subordinated to whatever the group wants you to do and whatever the group demands of you, that is fundamentally an illiberal idea. It is against human freedom in all respects. And so, having sort of, but we have such stupid categories that we use, conservative versus liberal, over the last 100 years. These categories are all wrong the way we've made them. And so people get thrown in with their opposites as if they're allies. And then we have this idea that, well, we have this political spectrum where there's like Nazis on the one side, communists on the other side. And if you're not one of those, you're in the middle somehow between Nazism and communism. Well, how does that make any sense? I think we need, the fundamental realignment we have to have is individualism as the moral base, which goes back to the founding of this country, and liberalism, meaning advocacy of freedom in all respects, on one side, and various kinds of collectivism, of illiberalism, of subordination to the group, various different flavors of that on the other side. That should be our political spectrum. It should be freedom versus dictatorship. And then, that's what, as Ronald Reagan said, was it, it's not an up or right or left, it's up versus down, up to the maximum of freedom and down to totalitarianism. And I think that's how we need to readjust our whole way of thinking about things.
Well said. So where can people find you?
Well, they can find me at the Tracinski letter, tracinskiletter.com. And that takes you to my Substack newsletter, my main one. I also have symposium.substack.com, where I talk a lot about this idea of the political spectrum and liberalism. And you can find my columns at Discourse magazine and published various other places, and doing occasional events for the Atlas Society.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being here. For now, this is go ahead. I'm sorry.
My pleasure.
Oh,
I was happy to be here.
Thank you. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Remember, leave your comments. I want to know what you think. It's important. Till next time.